Jorge, you have a new book coming out with the University Press of Florida. Congratulations. It is a co-edited collection, and your co-editor is Carmen Aide Rivera. The book is called Cuba and Puerto Rico, Transdisciplinary Approaches to History, Literature, and Culture. I think that as somebody who's specialized in Cuba and Puerto Rico, that this is a really extraordinary moment to have contributed such a volume, because we have parallel problems in Puerto Rico, and perhaps the nature of their causes is quite different, but there are real reasons to put Cuba in conversation with Puerto Rico and Puerto Rico in conversation with Cuba. So I wonder if you could address that question of why compare Cuba and Puerto Rico.
Yeah, and I want to mention that you have a chapter in the book as well, so I thank you for it, and I think it's one of the most interesting chapters that compares it to the two islands or archipelagos. So why Cuba and Puerto Rico? I think the short answer to that is because these are two societies that have so much in common historically, culturally, even politically, and in many other ways. The literature, the language, the religion, the food, the music has unmistakable connections. And these are the kinds of things that our collaborators are about 15, if I remember correctly, in the book itself, both Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and others who are Americans. There's a Panamanian scholar as well. So it's a very multinational set of contributors. In the book, each one of the contributors focuses on a different aspect of this relationship between the two islands, whether it's history, literature, culture, politics, and so on. And what we all have in common, I think, is that we're all fascinated by this phrase, this poetic line by Lola Rodriguez Estudio, that Cuba and Puerto Rico are like the two wings of one bird. And actually, we wanted to have that as a title of the book itself. And I'm looking at myself now, and the screen, I have the two flags of Cuba and Puerto Rico in the background, which also reflect this very strong political, cultural link between the two islands, dating back not only to the 19th century independence struggles, but even to the Taínos in the pre-Columbian era. So all throughout the Spanish colonial period, there were strong links between the two islands. There was movement of people between Cuba and Puerto Rico. And of course, these were the last two remaining possessions of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. Now, of course, after 1898, after the Spanish, Cuban, American, Filipino War, to be politically correct, the two trajectories of the two islands diverged increasingly, especially after 1959. So Cuba became an independent nation, at least in name. Puerto Rico remained a possession or an overseas territory of the United States. And of course, Cuba became, after 1959, increasingly distant from the United States, particularly after, as you mentioned, declaring itself to be a socialist government, whereas Puerto Rico's Commonwealth government increasingly became integrated politically and economically into the U.S. orbit. However, there are several parallel processes that many of the contributors examine. For example, migration, large-scale migration from both Cuba and Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, beginning in the 1940s and 50s, in Cuba, mostly after 59, the development of these diasporic communities in Florida, in New York, and other parts of the United States, oftentimes close to each other, as in Miami or Orlando, or even in New York and New Jersey. And so these connections have not been lost. Although, of course, the two islands exemplify different kinds of models of economic and political development. In the case of Cuba, of course, a socialist, at least in the first years, a socialist development path, whereas Puerto Rico followed a capitalist dependent path closely associated with the United States. And finally, I would say that, I think you hinted at the beginning, regardless of the differences between the two countries, nowadays, both countries find themselves in very similar predicaments. So, for example, the development model that provided a lot of economic growth in Puerto Rico in the 1950s, 60s, and even until the early 70s, Operation Bootstrap, no longer works. And I think there's a consensus in Puerto Rico that there has to be some other sort of development model that should be explored. Similarly for Cuba, after the fall of the Soviet Union, after the development of a state kind of socialism, that doesn't really satisfy either the left or the more conservative sectors of the Cuban population. And after the development of the private sector, the non-state sector in Cuba, now you have a kind of a mixed economy, but it's still controlled by the Communist Party on the island. So there are different ways of looking at the future of the two archipelagos and wondering whether they might come together once again. Beyond culture, beyond music, religion, and language, we still are, I think, very much the primary connection between the two places.
Do you think that there are really primary lessons we can derive from the experiences of Cuba and Puerto Rico politically over the course of the last 30 years? I mean, it has been since about 1996 that the nature of the sort of key nature of that model of development that was promoted by the United States, supported by the United States, Operation Bootstraps, tax holidays, to put it in sort of simple terms, for U.S. corporations wishing to invest in Puerto Rico, that ended. You also had in 1991 to 1992 the elimination in Cuba of the Soviet bloc and its ability to trade within the Soviet bloc and receive highly subsidized price for Cuban sugar and basically free Cuban oil, or excuse me, Soviet oil. So these two development models collapsed virtually at the same time, one within 5 years of each other. And then second, you have a real decline, I think perhaps more so in Cuba than in Puerto Rico, in people's faith in the nature of the political system. I mean, in Cuba, the legitimacy of the government, I would say the illegitimacy of the government perhaps peaked in the mid to late 90s, and then has just continued to decline ever since. Perhaps in some sectors more than others. But what of Puerto Rico? How have Puerto Ricans responded to their government's inability to address major crises, such as that caused by hurricanes? For just to give one example.
I think of three main themes that would be interested in examining the future of the two islands. One of them is, of course, as you mentioned, that the model of depending on an outside superpower, the United States or the Soviet Union, or even Venezuela in the case of Cuba, is not working anymore and perhaps never worked. But certainly the subsidies, the massive subsidies that the Soviet Union sent to Cuba to sustain what is, in the long run, I think, an unsustainable model of development in Cuba, suggests that there's a need to look somewhere else, not to the outside, not to other countries, but actually at the resources, a very extensive human resource, for example, that Cuba and Puerto Rico also have developed in the last half century or so. And similarly, in the case of Puerto Rico, I think the over-reliance on federal funding, particularly, which is probably the first number one source of income for most of the poor populations, for food stamps to student loans and all kinds of subsidies, again, is no longer tenable. At one point, perhaps combined with the very solid manufacturing sector that Puerto Rico developed after World War II, perhaps it was enough to sustain a rapid rate of growth, but that model no longer serves the needs of most of the Puerto Rican population. So that would be one sort of way forward to see if there's a path, a different path than the ones that were explored both in Cuba and Puerto Rico, that don't rely so much on outside support, on subsidies from another country. The other part of the response that I would give to your question is that the main response to these crises has been migration, both in Cuba and Puerto Rico, more so in Puerto Rico than in Cuba, because all Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens and therefore are free to move whenever they want. So what we've seen, again, just as there has been a tremendous growth of Cuban migration in the last couple of years, the largest single migration of Puerto Rico from Puerto Rico to the United States in the last 10 years or so, even more than the so-called Great Migration after World War II. And so now there are about 5.8 million Puerto Ricans living in the mainland as opposed to 3.3 million on the island. And I think that's a reflection of this very profound crisis, which is economic, it's also political. And on the political front, of course, we have seen in several plebiscites conducted in Puerto Rico in the last few years that there's a consensus that the present status, the so-called Estado Libre Asociado, the free associated state, doesn't work anymore. There is no consensus, however, on where to go, whether it's independence or statehood into the United States or some sort of free association. But again, that political model, similar again to the one in Cuba, is in a severe crisis. And so I would expect that in the next few years, perhaps, there'll be more thinking, more research, and more policy trying to figure out a way to move from this impasse between the U.S. and Puerto Rico.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duany, for joining us and for your wonderful insights into both Cuba and Puerto Rico.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.